22-year-old Pamela Smart was a married high school teacher desperate for excitement.
She wanted to stay in the kind of more wild lifestyle. She wanted to be a rock and roller.
16-year-old Billy Flynn was her lonely student who had a serious crush on his teacher.
As he laid eyes on her, he whispered to his friend, "I'm in love."
Their mutual attraction collided in an explosion of passion and ecstasy.
You're 16 years old, and this beautiful teacher is lavishing all this affection and attention on you.
But their forbidden romance would come at a deadly cost.
Police find this man lying right inside the front door.
It was this typical gangland type execution style killing.
Now get an insider's view into one of the most shocking and salacious crimes in U.S. history. And learn how a school teacher seduced her student with lessons in lust, deception, and cold-blooded murder.
Pam, did you have anything to do with your husband's murder?
May 1st, 1990. It was a peaceful Tuesday evening in Derry, New Hampshire. But at a quiet condo complex on Misty Morning Drive, the nighttime serenity was suddenly shattered by an alarming sound.
A neighbor hears screaming. Something has happened to my husband.
The screams were coming from the condo of newlywed couple Pamela and Greg Smart. And when police arrived on the scene moments later, they found Pamela inside the front door of her home, with her husband's bloody and lifeless body sprawled at her feet.
Police find this man lying right inside the front door to his condominium.
He was shot in the head, execution style.
But what had happened? Pamela told police she'd just arrived home from a late night at work, only to find her husband shot dead in the foyer. There was no sign of his attacker, but their condo was in tatters, which indicated a potential motive to police.
The impression was it was a robbery gone bad.
It was an unusual crime for such a quiet and close-knit community. But no one was prepared for the shocking twists and turns this mystery would take in the days to come, or the scandalous relationship that was at the heart of this crime between a sensual instructor and a teacher's pet who'd do anything to please her. Born in 1967, Pamela Wojcik grew up in a happy and privileged home in Windham, New Hampshire.
Pamela Smart was raised in a upper middle class family.
She was, a very sort of flamboyantly full of life kind of person.
Her perky personality and cute-as-a-button looks made young Pamela the center of attention wherever she went. And attention was what Pamela craved. As a teenager, she dominated the high school's social scene.
She's beautiful, blonde, cheerleader, a big personality.
By the time high school was over, Pamela was determined to have a career that would keep her in the spotlight.
She envisioned herself as being, an anchor woman or some kind of media celebrity.
To pursue her dreams of stardom, Pamela enrolled at Florida State University, where she studied broadcasting. At Florida State, Pamela proved to be just as popular, and she relished in the new freedom and experiences that college provided. But what Pamela loved more than anything were the heavy metal shows held almost nightly at clubs around campus.
She loved rock and roll music. She was a DJ in college.
And it was at a New Year's Eve party while on break back in New Hampshire where Pamela met a handsome 23-year-old who loved metal music as much as she did. His name was Greg Smart.
He's a good-looking rock and roll guy, with long hair and great personality. People love this guy.
Greg found Pamela just as irresistible. The couple began dating and soon were inseparable. Greg followed Pamela back to Florida as she finished college, where the couple spent their evenings at rock shows and nightclubs, celebrating their shared love for both loud music and fast times. When Pam graduated in 1988, they moved back to New Hampshire. Greg's parents helped them find a condo in Derry. A few months later, Greg proposed, and Pam said yes, with the idea that she and Greg had many more years ahead to look forward to being the area's preeminent headbanging couple.
The picture I get of them is being the life of the party.
But with home and family now in his mind, Greg did the unthinkable. After some prodding from his father, he cut his hair, put on a suit, and became a salesman at his father's insurance firm. Pamela could hardly believe it.
That did not sit well with Pam at all. She wanted to stay in the kind of more wild lifestyle. She wanted to be a rock and roller still.
Marriage forced Pamela to sell out too. Her dreams of stardom never took off like she imagined. And after being turned down for an on-air position at all the local news stations, she took a job as a media coordinator at Winnicott High School, 45 minutes away from Derry. But the new job had a surprising perk. Pam quickly discovered she had a lot in common with her students.
She's surrounded by young kids who are into everything that she's into, rock and roll music and dancing and having a good time.
At home, Pamela Smart felt as if her needs were being ignored in an increasingly boring marriage. But at Winnicott High School, she was both in charge and the most popular girl in school.
It made her feel important and powerful and amazing. Who wouldn't feel that way? These kids are practically worshiping you.
To the girls, Pamela was a smart and sophisticated role model. But the 22-year-old's ample figure and sultry good looks also made her every high school boy's fantasy. And Pamela enjoyed the attention. In fact, there was one student she found herself particularly drawn to. 16-year-old sophomore, Billy Flynn.
She started working with Billy Flynn. She started becoming attracted to him. I think she started enjoying her relationship with him because it was somewhat of a simplistic relationship.
Born in 1974, Billy Flynn was raised in a troubled household. For the first decade of his life, his parents' loveless marriage was a battle zone, with Billy caught in the middle.
He did come from a family where he witnessed verbal abuse between his parents, and that can be traumatizing to a child.
Like so many troubled kids, Billy found solace in music. As he grew into a handsome teenager, Billy lived for rock and roll. It wasn't long before he found others who felt the same way. At Winnicott High School, Billy fell in with the outsider crowd and began to come out of his shell. And it was there that he first encountered Pamela Smart.
He had a strong attraction to Pam as soon as he laid eyes on her. He whispered to his friend, "I'm in love," as soon as he saw her.
At first, Pamela seemed completely out of Billy's league. There was no way, Billy thought, that a hot, married woman 6 years his senior could be interested in him. And yet the more time they spent together, the more Billy began to feel like there just might be something there.
They're working together closely every day for long hours, and so they're becoming even closer. They're becoming good friends.
Soon, Billy had joined Pamela's inner circle of favorite students, and Pamela found herself fighting back feelings of her own for Billy.
He is pretty much exactly what Greg used to be. He's got the long hair, and he's loves rock and roll music.
But Pamela was determined to keep her fantasies about Billy to herself. She was married, and in spite of the feelings he'd awakened in her, Billy was still a minor. But in early 1990, Pamela discovered that she wasn't the only unhappy one in their marriage. Greg made a shocking confession. He'd had an affair.
That night, he admitted that he had slept with another woman.
Pam was devastated. Greg swore it hadn't meant anything and still wanted to make the marriage work. He even planned a celebration for their one-year anniversary. But Pamela viewed Greg's cheating as just the latest in a series of betrayals.
He cut his hair, and now he cheated on me. I'm not sure I'm really in for this, for the long haul.
Her husband's infidelity was all the push Pamela needed to act on her feelings for Billy.
She called him in one day and said to him, "Do you think about me when we're not together? Because I think about you all the time."
Pamela knew Billy desired her, and that afternoon, after school, Pamela took the next step. With Greg safely out of town on a business trip, she invited Billy into her home and into her bed.
She comes out with lingerie on, and then they have sex for the first time right then and there.
For Pamela, the hot and steamy encounter provided exactly the kind of excitement that had been missing from her life. She also enjoyed taking control in the bedroom. Since Billy was a virgin, she became his teacher in more ways than one. But for Billy, it meant even more. He wasn't only living out a teenage fantasy, he was completely smitten with Pamela, and unlike her husband, completely devoted to her. Before long, the secret lovers were spending every possible moment together, in and out of the classroom.
It's not just sexual, it's emotional. She's calling him on the phone constantly. She's constantly meeting with him. They're together in the school, they're together after school.
But as Pamela's taboo romance with Billy deepened, her daily drive back to her home and Greg became a private hell of soul-searching and doubt. Pamela knew that she would soon have to choose between the boy she loved and the man she married. But then, a seemingly random act of violence made the choice for her. Coming up, as police begin their investigation into Greg Smart's murder, details from the scene force them to question the true motive behind the crime.
There were enough things about this case that made it inconsistent with a botched burglary.
And Pamela Smart takes to the airwaves in the wake of her husband's death, and in the process, becomes a controversial media darling.
That was a little odd, given she'd just lost her husband in a terrible, horrific crime.
When 22-year-old Pamela Smart began working as a media coordinator at Winnicott High School, her youth and her seductive good looks made her an instant hit with the students, especially the boys. Stuck in a listless marriage, the attention gave Pamela a chance to relive her glory days. And it hadn't been long before she blurred the line between teacher and student.
I don't think she ever left those teenage glory years of high school. Being at Winnicott was just a part of her continuing those years.
After her husband Greg admitted to having an affair, Pamela decided to take a classroom flirtation with handsome 16-year-old Billy Flynn to the next level.
He's this good-looking 16-year-old boy with big brown eyes and soft, long brown hair. And again, he plays the electric guitar, so, he's perfect for her.
Billy's unhappy childhood and broken home had left him with emotional needs as hard to deny as his teenage libido. For the first time in his life, Billy felt loved and needed.
He was someone who really was looking for love and attention and affirmation in a woman.
Despite their passion, Pamela recognized that their love affair couldn't go on the same way forever. It wouldn't be long before the young woman would have to choose between a stable present with her husband Greg or an unknown but potentially far more exciting future with Billy. But before she could make her decision, tragedy struck. May 1st, 1990, police arrived at Pamela and Greg Smart's condo to discover Greg shot dead in the foyer and Pamela in hysterics. First responders were convinced that Greg had simply walked into a burglary in progress.
That was pretty much the consensus was, oh, he must have surprised someone coming in.
But by the next morning, the investigators had completed a thorough examination of the scene. And what they learned began to tell a different story. The condo doors and windows showed no signs of forced entry. And while the Smarts' condo was ransacked, very little was found to be actually missing.
There were enough things about this case that made it inconsistent with a botched burglary case. And so they started to think this is really supposed to look like a botched burglary.
A careful examination of the position of Greg's body raised the biggest red flag of all.
There wasn't a lot of signs of a struggle. It was basically him kneeling down and being shot in the head.
Derry detectives knew that execution-style murders of this type were often personal, and either acts of punishment or the ultimate form of debt payment. Was it possible the supposedly straight-laced insurance salesman had been connected with something or someone unsavory enough to warrant such a cold-blooded extermination?
Your everyday average Joe doesn't get killed by gangland-style execution unless something else is involved, whether it's gambling or drugs or something else. Usually there's another connection.
Friends told police that Greg's hell-bent headbanger days were over. But investigators had to wonder, might the reformed rocker have secretly kept the party going into his married life?
Early on, there was a lot of rumors flying around. Maybe there's a drug deal that went bad.
Greg's widow grew increasingly furious about the rumors surrounding her husband's tragic death. Initially, Pam had kept silent about the case, but with her husband's memory now being tarnished, Pamela reached out to a local news station and volunteered to set the record straight. On camera.
Pam Smart started contacting the press, trying to defend her husband, saying this wasn't a drug deal, and almost inviting and encouraging interviews.
The media-savvy young widow sat for any interview she could arrange.
It's a process of elimination. They do have to explore all kinds of different avenues.
But some close to the case began to wonder if the would-be broadcaster was treating her still very recent personal tragedy as a professional opportunity.
It seemed for her own self-gratification. And that was a little odd, given she'd just lost her husband in a terrible, horrific crime.
To detectives at the Derry Police Department, Pamela's TV grandstanding was just one of several troubling behaviors officers had observed.
They actually realized that she'd done some strange things.
When first responders arrived at the murder scene, Pamela was hysterical. But within minutes, she became utterly calm. As detectives processed the scene, Pam had repeatedly referred to her freshly dead husband as simply the body. And the morning after the murder, when police let Pamela back into the apartment to retrieve personal items, she walked right over the massive bloodstain left by Greg's corpse as if it were nothing.
Everything she did was described as being a little off. She was more concerned about her dog than about him, and, all sorts of things.
But as odd and suspicious as Pamela's behavior might have been, police couldn't consider her a suspect. Pamela Smart had been nowhere near the scene of the crime when Greg had been shot, and she could prove it.
No one is looking at Pamela Smart as being the killer because she's got a rock-solid alibi.
She was legitimately 45 minutes away at a school committee meeting, and there's other people there, and there's no mistaking the fact that she was there. So she did not commit the murder.
But if Pam Smart hadn't killed her husband, who had? With only rumors and speculation to go on, police soon found themselves at a dead end. But a surprising admission would soon put their investigation on track and lead to not one, but a group of suspects too shocking to believe. Coming up, an overheard conversation points detectives in the direction of Greg Smart's killer.
It is possibly the case breaker right here. This is a gigantic deal. Gigantic.
But not before the murder weapon is hand-delivered to investigators' door.
I can't imagine that there are many times when you get the smoking gun walk into your station, handed to you on your lap.
Trapped in a failing marriage, 22-year-old high school teacher Pamela Smart sought refuge in the arms of her 16-year-old student, Billy Flynn.
Billy Flynn was a 16-year-old kid. He was tall, good-looking. Pam Smart was reliving some of her own youth where she was into metal or rock and roll, and Billy Flynn was into that.
Pamela and Billy's romance was a secret to anyone outside of Pamela's inner circle of devoted students at Winnicott High School. But on May 1st, 1990, Derry, New Hampshire police found Greg Smart dead of a gunshot wound. As their search for answers continued, Pamela and Billy's clandestine relationship was about to take center stage. Initially, investigators judged Greg Smart's murder to be a burglary gone wrong. But as they processed the scene, police discovered things weren't what they seemed. Forensic examination confirmed that Greg's death had been a deliberate execution, and the burglary itself appeared to have been staged.
People started going, wait a minute, something's, this doesn't seem random at all anymore.
Spotlight hungry, Pamela's eagerness to appear on camera also drew police suspicion.
She appeared to take great pleasure in being interviewed, being on TV, putting on the role of the grieving widow.
And yet Pamela had a rock-solid alibi. After more than a month, police had to admit they were no closer to solving the murder than when they first arrived on the scene.
It seemed like nothing was happening for a very long time.
We still have no idea who actually pulled the trigger or why, and the trail has gone completely cold.
But one morning, a man arrived at a police station in Seabrook, New Hampshire, some 40 minutes east of Derry, with a story and a gun.
All of a sudden, they have this man walk in and say, hey, I don't know what connection it might have, but I have this gun and I have a feeling it might have been involved in a murder.
The man, Vance Latomy Sr., told officers he was an avid gun collector, and he had a 17-year-old son named Vance Latomy Jr., who everyone knew as JR. According to Vance Sr., his son's friend Ralph had recently overheard JR and two friends talking about a crime they'd committed using one of Vance Sr.'s pistols. When Vance checked his collection for anything out of place, he discovered that a .38 caliber pistol he knew was a favorite of JR's wasn't in the condition it should have been.
He knew that he had shot the gun himself and then put it away dirty. And he went in his drawer where he kept the gun, and the gun was spick and span.
Seabrook police reviewed unsolved gun crimes in the region and found a match for a murder involving a .38. The Greg Smart killing in Derry.
Seabrook police called the Derry police. Hey, we've just had a man walk in here who presented us with what could be the murder weapon in the Greg Smart case.
Analysis by the Derry police confirmed that Vance Latomy Sr.'s .38 fired the bullet that killed Greg Smart, which meant J.R. Latomy was now the prime suspect in Greg's murder. For detectives in Derry, it was the break they'd been hoping for.
I can't imagine that there are many times when you get the smoking gun walk into your station, handed to you on your lap.
But the new discovery begged a whole new set of questions. Derry and Seabrook were 45 minutes apart. Why would a 17-year-old like J.R. Latomy go all that way to kill Greg Smart? And what had been his motive? To establish a connection between J.R. and Greg Smart, police first needed to learn the names of the other boys J.R. had been talking to about the crime.
Now they've got to start looking at all of his closest friends. Who are they? Who does this kid, JR, hang with?
JR's friend Ralph told police that the kids they were looking for were JR's high school classmates, Pete Randall and Billy Flynn. And when detectives did a background check on the three juveniles, they made a very interesting discovery. All were students at Winnicott High, and each of the three had been involved in school activities with Pamela Smart.
Now, obviously, everything starts pointing in a direction of Pam Smart and having some connection to these boys, and these boys clearly having a connection to the homicide.
But what was that connection? Police knew there was only one way to find out. On June 11th, police brought JR, Pete, and Billy down to the station for questioning. When detectives separated the three high schoolers and began interrogating them one by one, they didn't have to push very hard for the facts.
They know now that they're caught, and their best bet is to just let the truth come out.
A frightened Jason told investigators that the three teens had specifically targeted the home of their teacher. But why had the teens targeted their teacher's husband? And what had been their true motive behind the shooting? Pressed for her, Billy Flynn and Pamela Smart had been having an affair.
Think about how you would be if you're 16 years old and this beautiful teacher is lavishing all this affection and attention on you. You'd be like a puppy dog. What wouldn't you do for a person like this?
Could jealousy have been the motive? Was Billy so smitten with his teacher that he killed her husband to be with her? JR couldn't say for sure, but he was able to lay out the details of what happened the night of the murder. JR told police that he, Billy, Pete, and their friend Raymond drove the 40 miles to the Smarts condo complex in Derry. JR and Raymond waited in the car, while Pete and Billy entered the condo. As detectives took notes, Pete Randall revealed what happened next. Pete and Billy entered the empty apartment together via a door Pamela Smart had left unlocked for them. Once inside, they ransacked the apartment and nervously waited in the dark for Greg to arrive home. Finally, they heard Greg Smart's keys in the front door. Unarmed and caught by surprise, Greg was helpless. Using a knife and Vance Latomy Sr.'s .38, Pete and Billy made Greg kneel in front of them. What happened next was so shocking and horrible, Billy Flynn could only describe it through tears.
Pete Randall held a knife to Greg Smart's neck, and Bill Flynn took the gun out, put it to Greg Smart's head, and said, "God forgive me," and pulled the trigger.
The revelation of the affair, combined with Billy's cold-blooded execution of Pam's husband, seemed to confirm investigators' suspicion about the motive behind the murder. But to their surprise, Billy insisted the crime hadn't been born out of jealousy. It had been to protect Pamela. Billy claimed that as his affair with Pamela grew more intense, she'd confided to him that Greg had become physically abusive, and she was afraid of what he might do to her if he discovered their affair.
She made it very apparent that she was in fear, that he was going to hurt her. He is in the situation where he could lose the center of his universe.
For Billy, whose love for Pamela now bordered on obsession, there was only one thing to do.
She needed protection. She was the damsel in distress to Billy Flynn. Billy Flynn was the knight in shining armor, in his mind.
But had he really been acting on his own? Or had Pamela manipulated Billy, intentionally planting the seeds for murder when she told her impressionable young lover about her husband's abuse? Coming up, an eyewitness comes forward, claiming to know the real reason why Greg Smart was murdered.
If she got a divorce, she'd lose the condominium, she'd lose her car.
And a secret police sting operation shows Pamela's true colors.
She had a very strange view of the value of people's lives.
High school teacher Pamela Smart and her student Billy Flynn had become embroiled in a secret and passionate affair. But not long after the couple began sneaking around, Pamela's husband was discovered dead of a single gunshot wound. When police found the murder weapon, they traced it back to Billy and 3 of his teenage friends. And once in custody, each of the 4 boys confessed to their involvement in the murder conspiracy. But investigators suspected that the teenagers hadn't acted alone.
Police have the whole story lined out for them, which is amazing. The problem is it's coming from 4 teenagers, and not the most credible of witnesses, with not the best of backgrounds either.
When detectives pushed the teens about Pamela's involvement, they finally came clean and confirmed police suspicions. The murder had been Pamela's idea from the very beginning, and love-struck Billy had been eager to please her.
She was the puppeteer behind all of this.
But investigators knew they would need more evidence if they expected to charge Pamela in the crime. So they decided to turn to another student at the school and another witness. One name each of the teen conspirators had mentioned repeatedly during their marathon interrogation sessions had been Cecilia Pierce. Like Billy, Cecilia was in the inner circle of Pamela Smart's high school clique.
Billy Flynn started talking about Pam Smart and their relationship and how Cecilia Pierce could also corroborate a lot of what he was saying.
During an interview early in the investigation, Cecilia gave investigators nothing but evasive answers. Now, armed with Billy's confession, police played hardball with the teenager. Faced with the possibility of jail, Cecilia cooperated fully.
She started to get nervous that she was going to get into some legal trouble and that it would actually be in her best interest to finally just tell the truth.
Under intense questioning, Cecilia admitted that she'd been more than Pamela Smart's intern, and she claimed to know the real reason why Pamela had her husband killed.
She suddenly reveals she didn't just know Pamela Smart, she was a close confidant. She knows all about this affair between Billy Flynn and Pam Smart.
Cecilia described watching Billy and Pamela's between-class flirtation grow more intense. She'd even been along when Pamela and Billy first had sex at Pamela's condo.
She was downstairs watching a movie, I think, and was told to go take the dog for a walk.
She went upstairs to see what was going on and opened the door, and they were having sex right there in the bedroom.
At first, Cecilia told police the secret student-teacher affair seemed to be a dream come true for both Billy and Pamela. But after a few weeks, Cecilia noticed that Pamela was becoming manipulative.
The power she had over Billy was she was a person in authority who became the center of his universe, was the light of his life, and he would do anything for her. That's a tremendous power.
Cecilia said that Pamela took perverse pleasure in twisting Billy around her finger and testing the love-struck teen with mind games. According to Cecilia, Pamela's claims of abuse were just another head trip. Cecilia said that Pamela revealed that Greg had never abused her, and that her real reasons for getting rid of Greg were far more cold-blooded.
If she got a divorce, she'd lose the condominium, she'd lose her car, all of the good things in life that she suddenly acquired would be gone.
Cecilia also made it clear to detectives that it wasn't Pamela who was scared to commit the crime. It was Billy. When Pamela first asked Billy to kill her husband, Cecilia said that the sensitive teen balked at taking another life. Then, Pamela played her trump card and told Billy outright that if he didn't murder her husband, they were through.
She said they could never be together as long as Greg was around.
Pam told Billy, I want you to kill my husband, and if you don't kill him, I'm leaving you. We're all done.
As incentive to the other boys, Pamela promised them a piece of Greg's life insurance payout.
Her husband had a $140,000 life insurance policy, which back in the late 80s, that was a lot of money.
It was a stunning testimony, but police knew that if they wanted charges against Pamela to stick, they needed more than just a confession from yet another teenager. To impress a jury, police needed Pamela to dish on the details of the killing herself, which meant they needed to record her discussing the crime with someone she trusted. And the task of getting Pamela to tell all fell to Cecilia and a wire.
Cecilia Pierce is the perfect decoy, or the person to wear this hidden wire. Pam and her are close friends. She, above anybody else, would be the best person to draw out new information from Pam.
Police were counting on Pamela's manipulative and outgoing personality to make her say more than she should. Wearing the hidden recording device, Cecilia met with Pamela a few days later. Police anxiously listened in as the two friends started off their conversation by making small talk. They talked about the ongoing police investigation and the arrest of Billy and his friends. Then, as Pamela began asking Cecilia about what she'd told the police, the tone of her voice suddenly changed.
And if you tell the truth, you are probably going to be arrested. And even if you're not arrested, you're going to have to go and you're going to have to send Bill, you're going to have to send me, you're going to have to send JR, you're going to have to send me to the slammer for the rest of our entire life.
The language and the things that Pam Smart says on these tapes is a confession. She never denies the involvement. All she does is continue to convince Cecilia Pierce to cover it up.
Confident they now had enough to prosecute her for murder, Derry police moved in and arrested Pamela Smart.
They literally walk into her office during work hours and say there's good news and bad news. The good news is we've solved the murder. The bad news is you're under arrest.
With Pamela finally in custody, prosecutors began building what they hoped would be an airtight case against the high school instructor. The first step was securing the courtroom testimony from her four co-conspirators: Billy Flynn, J.R. Latomy, Pete Randall, and Raymond Fowler. The state offered them each plea bargains, and all four boys took them.
Because of their age and their ability to be manipulated by Pam Smart, it wasn't that difficult to offer them a deal in which they could get out of jail, because it seemed like the right thing to do given how young they were and who they were.
And while the state prepared its case, the national media became fixated on the salacious story of a seductive teacher who used sex and deceit to convince her student to kill.
It had all of the ingredients of a wonderful daytime drama. It's got sex, it's got drugs, it's got rock and roll, it's got murder, it's got it all.
And as they took their seats in the courtroom on the first day of the trial, both sides wondered what the jury and the viewing public would decide. But as the country tuned in to watch what looked to be shaping up as the trial of the decade, no one knew for sure which side the jury would believe: the young man who claimed he was manipulated into committing murder, or the adulterous teacher who said her student had acted on his own. Coming up, the sensational murder trial for Pam Smart gets underway, and millions of viewers watch spellbound as a young man bares his soul.
God forgive me.
22-year-old Pamela Smart was an ambitious, media-savvy vixen with dreams of becoming rich and famous. Instead, she'd achieved notoriety as a cold-blooded killer. Along with her 16-year-old lover, Billy Flynn, she stood accused of murdering her husband, 23-year-old Greg Smart. Investigators believed Pamela had manipulated Billy into doing her bidding, twisting his love for her into a motive to commit the heinous crime.
Think about how you would be if you're 16 years old and this beautiful teacher is lavishing all this affection and attention on you. What wouldn't you do for a person like this?
As prosecutors prepared their case, the salacious details of the murder whipped the media into a frenzy, turning it into national news. Now, not only did the state have to try their case in front of a jury, but also a record-breaking viewing audience tuning in on live TV.
This is a gigantic deal. Gigantic.
In March of 1991, less than a year after Greg Smart was found dead of a single gunshot wound to the head, Pamela Smart went on trial. One by one, J.R. Latomy, Pete Randall, Raymond Fowler, and Cecilia Pierce took the stand. Each told the jury what they'd already admitted to detectives about the night of May 1st, 1990.
They all come up with the exact same story, everything jives, and they don't make any mistakes, and their stories don't vary at all.
Then, as a packed courtroom and a television audience of millions watched on, Billy Flynn was sworn in as a witness for the prosecution. It was his 17th birthday. And in vivid detail, he recounted for the jury the moment he took Greg Smart's life.
I said, God forgive me.
After you said, God forgive me, what happened?
I pulled the trigger.
Billy described for the jury what it was like to be seduced by Pam, their passionate love affair, and her ultimatum. Billy testified that he only went through the actual killing because Pamela wouldn't let him back out. And while under oath, Billy Flynn admitted the painful truth, he'd been duped by Pam. What Billy had mistaken for passion and trust, he now realized had just been a means to an end.
He realized that his thinking was ridiculous, that he could have a relationship with Pam Smart.
When Pamela Smart was finally called to the stand, she freely confessed to the affair. But Pamela calmly told the jury that the murder plot had been Billy's idea, not hers. When Billy and his co-conspirators were caught, they tried to pin their mistake on her.
Billy just took it upon himself and developed this whole plan himself. This elaborate, strategic murder plot.
But which side would the jury believe? On March 22nd, they returned with their verdict.
I'll say you, defendant guilty or not guilty of the offense charged. Guilty.
Pamela Smart was found guilty of conspiracy and being an accomplice to first-degree murder.
They believed the boys, they believed Cecilia, and they could clearly see that the one in all of them that was lying was Pam.
Pamela Smart was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, while Billy Flynn was sentenced to life with eligibility for parole after 40 years. To many, the affair between Pamela Smart and Billy Flynn destroyed not one, but 3 lives. Both Pamela and Billy will spend most, if not all, of the rest of their lives behind bars, while Greg Smart is dead because of his young wife's lust, obsession, and ruthlessness.
See that? That was amazing. I love this.
December 1989. In Mountain Brook, Alabama. The approach of Christmas brought with it the familiar rhythm of the season. Packages arriving at homes, envelopes appearing in mailboxes, ordinary deliveries becoming part of the background of daily life. For Judge Robert S. Vance and his family, there was nothing unusual about receiving a package. Vance was a federal appellate judge, a man whose work placed him inside one of the most important institutions in the American legal system. But on December 16th, an ordinary-looking package would become the center of a crime that would eventually stretch across several states, involve multiple bombing attempts, and lead investigators into the complicated history of a man named Walter Leroy Moody Jr. Vance was at his home in Mountain Brook with his wife, Helen. The package had arrived through the mail. There was no immediate reason for the family to believe that it contained anything dangerous. It was December, after all, and packages were part of the season. Yet when Robert Vance opened the package in the kitchen, the object inside exploded. The blast killed him. Helen Vance was seriously injured. In a matter of moments, a federal judge had been murdered inside his own home, not by someone who had walked through the door, but by something that had been delivered there. That distinction would become central to the investigation. The killer had not needed to confront Vance face to face. There had been no obvious warning, no visible attacker, and no immediate opportunity for the victim to understand what was happening. The postal system itself had been turned into the means of delivery. For investigators, the first task was to understand what had happened. But the deeper question was more disturbing. Why would someone want Robert Vance dead? Vance was not simply a private citizen caught in a random act of violence. He was a judge on the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit, a position that placed him within the federal judicial system of the American South. If the bombing was deliberate, and the nature of the explosion made that difficult to doubt, then the identity and motive of the attacker mattered enormously. A judge had been targeted. Was it revenge? Was it political violence? Was it an attack on the federal courts themselves? Or was there another explanation? At first, the investigation centered on the crime scene and the evidence left behind by the explosion. But investigators would soon discover that the package in Mountain Brook was only one part of something much larger. The bombing of Robert Vance had not occurred in isolation. During December 1989, four package bombs were sent to targets in Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. Two of those bombs exploded. The first killed Vance. The second would kill another man only 2 days later. On December 18th, a package bomb exploded at the office of Robert E. Robinson, a civil rights attorney in Savannah, Georgia. Robinson died in the attack. The two deaths immediately transformed the investigation. What had initially appeared to be the assassination of a federal judge now looked like part of a broader campaign. There were other packages, other targets, other potential victims, and investigators had to consider the possibility that more attacks could follow. Two additional bombs were discovered before they could cause further deaths. One was associated with the NAACP facility in Jacksonville, Florida. Another was sent toward the federal court system in Atlanta. Suddenly, the investigators were confronted with a troubling pattern. The targets did not seem to belong to one obvious category. Robert Vance was a federal judge. Robert Robinson was a civil rights attorney. The NAACP represented an entirely different kind of institution, and another package had been directed toward the federal courts. The question became not simply who had sent the bombs, but what the bomber wanted investigators to believe. If someone attacked a federal judge and then a black civil rights lawyer, while also targeting the NAACP, it was possible to suspect a racist or extremist motive. The evidence seemed capable of pointing in several directions at once. That uncertainty would become one of the most important features of the case. Investigators could not afford to assume that the most visible pattern was the real one. Somewhere behind the packages, the explosions, and the seemingly different targets was a person who had chosen them for a reason. The FBI would eventually give the investigation a name, VanPack, derived from the phrase Vance package bomb. The name reflected how closely the case was initially tied to the murder of the judge. But the investigation would soon reveal that the story began long before the package arrived at Vance's home. The trail would lead investigators backward into the history of Walter Leroy Moody Jr., a man who had already encountered the justice system in connection with explosives years before. Moody had been born in Georgia in 1935. In 1972, a bombing incident connected to his home left his wife injured, and Moody was convicted in connection with the possession of a pipe bomb. The conviction became a defining part of his relationship with the legal system. Moody believed that he had been treated unfairly by the courts. The anger did not disappear when the case ended. According to the investigative theory later developed by the FBI, that resentment remained important for years and eventually became connected to the attacks of 1989. There was also a connection between Moody and the federal appellate system. During the 1980s, Moody had a legal matter associated with the 11th Circuit. Robert Vance was a judge on that court. The connection was significant, but it contained an important irony. Vance had not been the person directly responsible for the decision from 1972 that Moody resented. Yet in Moody's view, Vance could become a representative of the judicial system itself. That distinction would become crucial to understanding the alleged motive. The murder of Robert Vance, then, was not simply a story about an explosive device and a package. It was the intersection of a federal judge's position, a defendant's long-standing resentment, and a series of attacks that appeared to have been designed to create confusion about their purpose. For the investigators standing at the beginning of the case, none of that was yet certain. They had a dead judge, an injured wife, another murdered man, 2 additional bombs that had been stopped, and a series of questions that seemed to multiply with every discovery. Who had constructed the devices? Who had mailed them? Why were these particular people and institutions selected? And was Robert Vance the true center of the attack, or simply one piece of a much larger plan? In the days that followed, the investigators would begin comparing the bombs. They would examine their construction, trace connections between the targets, and look backward into previous cases involving explosives. Eventually, one detail would stand out: similarities between the 1989 devices and the bomb connected to Walter Moody in 1972. That comparison would provide the first major path toward the man investigators believed was responsible. But before Moody became the central figure in the case, the investigators had to confront the reality left behind in Mountain Brook. Robert Vance had opened a package in his own kitchen and died because someone had decided that a message, an argument, or a grievance could be answered with murder. Helen Vance survived the blast, but she was seriously injured. Robert Robinson did not survive his own encounter with a package bomb 2 days later. And elsewhere, other people had narrowly escaped becoming victims. The investigation had begun with a single explosion. It was becoming something much larger, a search for a person who had learned how to make an ordinary delivery carry extraordinary danger. At the center of that search would eventually stand Walter Moody. But at the beginning, investigators did not yet have the complete story. They had only the fragments. A judge was dead. A civil rights attorney was dead. Other targets had been threatened. And somewhere in those fragments was the reason why Robert Vance had been chosen. Robert Smith Vance occupied a position that carried considerable authority within the American legal system. As a judge on the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit, he belonged to a level of the federal judiciary where decisions could affect cases across several states. His work placed him inside a system built around laws, appeals, judgments, and the belief that disputes could ultimately be settled through courts rather than through violence. That made the circumstances of his death especially disturbing. Vance was not killed while confronting a dangerous suspect or while walking into a volatile situation. He was killed at home. The weapon that ended his life arrived as a package, and when he opened it in his own kitchen, the ordinary act of receiving mail became fatal. To understand why investigators eventually believed Vance had been selected, however, they had to look beyond the December 1989 explosion. They had to look backward into the history of a man whose relationship with the justice system had become increasingly bitter. That man was Walter Leroy Moody Jr. Moody had been born in Georgia in 1935. Long before his name became associated with the bombing campaign of 1989, he had already encountered the criminal justice system in a case involving explosives. In 1972, a bombing incident connected to Moody's home resulted in an explosion that injured his wife. Moody was subsequently convicted in connection with the possession of a pipe bomb. The case became more than a legal event in his life. According to the investigative picture later developed by the FBI, Moody believed that the courts had treated him unfairly. The conviction and its consequences became part of a grievance that would remain with him for years. The important point was not simply that Moody had once been convicted in a case involving a bomb. It was that the earlier case established 2 elements that would later become central to the investigation: Moody's familiarity with explosives and his resentment toward the legal system. 17 years separated the events of 1972 from the bombing that killed Robert Vance. During that time, the original conviction did not simply disappear from Moody's history. His dissatisfaction with the justice system continued. The details of an old legal dispute could seem distant to someone looking at the case from the outside. But for investigators trying to understand motive, the past mattered. They were not searching only for someone capable of constructing an explosive device. They were searching for someone who might have a reason to use one against a member of the federal judiciary. In the 1980s, Moody became connected to a legal matter involving the 11th Circuit, the same federal appellate court on which Robert Vance served. This connection was significant because it offered a possible bridge between Moody's old grievance and the judge who would eventually become one of the victims. Yet there was an important distinction. Robert Vance was not directly responsible for the decision from 1972 that Moody resented. He was not the individual who had created the original problem in Moody's life. But from the perspective of investigators, the distinction between an individual judge and the institution he represented could become blurred in a mind consumed by resentment. Vance was a member of the 11th Circuit. He represented the federal judiciary. If Moody's anger had evolved from opposition to one particular legal outcome into hostility toward the system itself, then Vance could be perceived not as a private individual, but as a symbol. That possibility would later become central to the explanation of the bombing. It also helped explain one of the strangest elements of the case: why a man who was apparently angry with the justice system would target a particular judge, even though that judge had not been directly responsible for the original grievance. The answer, according to the investigative theory, was not necessarily personal. It was symbolic. The target represented something larger than himself. That made the case more difficult to understand because ordinary motives for murder often revolve around direct relationships. Revenge against a person who caused harm, financial gain, jealousy, or a personal conflict. Here, investigators believed they were dealing with something different. A long-standing grievance against a system had allegedly transformed into violence against one of its representatives. But there was another problem. Robert Vance was not the only person attacked. On December 18, 1989, 2 days after Vance's death, a package bomb killed Robert E. Robinson, a civil rights attorney in Savannah, Georgia. Other bombs had also been sent to targets including an NAACP facility in Jacksonville, Florida, and the federal court system in Atlanta. If the true motive was simply revenge against the judiciary, why were civil rights targets included? Why would a campaign directed, at least apparently, toward the courts also involve a black civil rights attorney and the NAACP? Those questions initially opened another possible explanation. The selection of Robinson and the NAACP could make the attacks appear racially motivated or connected to extremist politics. Such a pattern could lead investigators toward an entirely different suspect profile. But the FBI eventually considered another possibility. The different targets may have been intended to obscure the real motive. If the bomber wanted investigators to believe that the attacks were driven by racism or political extremism, then sending a bomb to a civil rights attorney or an NAACP facility could create exactly that impression. The appearance of the attacks could become part of the strategy. This was one of the most important complications in the investigation. The victims were real, the deaths were real, and the danger was real. But the apparent relationship between the targets might not have represented the actual motive behind the campaign. Somewhere within that confusion, investigators had to determine what connected all of the victims. Robert Vance provided one possible answer. His position within the federal judiciary made him a natural representative of the system Moody had come to resent. Moody's history with explosives provided another connection. His legal history provided another. But none of these facts, taken separately, proved that he was responsible for the 1989 attacks. The investigation would have to establish a connection between the devices themselves and the man, who had once been convicted in a case involving a pipe bomb. That was where the physical evidence would become crucial. Investigators could not rely only on motive. They needed something that could connect the crime scenes to Moody. They needed to know whether the bombs sent in 1989 resembled the device associated with him in 1972. They also needed to examine the packages, their materials, the people surrounding Moody, and the movements and communications that might place him within the investigation. The case was therefore moving along two parallel paths. One was psychological and historical. Why would someone want to attack a federal judge? The other was physical and forensic. Who could actually have constructed and delivered the devices? The answer would have to emerge from the intersection of both. Robert Vance's death gave investigators the first unmistakable sign that someone had chosen violence. Against the judiciary, Walter Moody's history offered a possible explanation for why such violence might have occurred. But the distance between suspicion and proof was enormous. A man could be angry at the courts without becoming a murderer. He could have a history involving explosives without being responsible for a later bombing. And he could have a legal connection to the same appellate court without targeting one of its judges. Investigators, therefore, had to proceed carefully. They had a victim whose position mattered. They had a suspect whose history mattered, but they needed evidence that connected the two. As the investigation deepened, the bomb itself would become one of the most important pieces of that evidence. A specialist with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms noticed similarities between the 1989 devices and the bomb associated with Moody in 1972. That observation would change the direction of the case. What had begun as an apparently mysterious assassination was becoming a much more focused investigation. The past was no longer merely background. It was beginning to resemble a blueprint for understanding the present. Robert Vance had become a victim in December 1989, but the story of why he was targeted appeared to reach back 17 years. The investigators' task now was to determine whether that connection was real. If it was, then the package that killed a federal judge was not an isolated act of violence. It was the latest expression of a grievance that had survived for years, directed at a system that Walter Moody believed had wronged him. And if investigators could prove that the same man stood behind the devices, they would finally have a path from the dead judge in Mountain Brook to the suspect whose history had begun in a very different bombing case back in 1972. By the time investigators began to understand that the death of Judge Robert S. Vance was not an isolated act, the case had already become something far more disturbing. The package that killed Vance in Mountain Brook, Alabama, was only one of 4 explosive packages sent during December 1989. 2 of them would result in deaths. 2 others would be discovered and neutralized before they could claim additional victims. Together, they created a pattern that forced investigators to reconsider almost everything they initially believed about the attack. The first package had reached Robert Vance at his home. Vance was a federal appellate judge, a member of the 11th Circuit, and a representative of the federal judiciary. When he opened the package in his kitchen on December 16th, the bomb exploded. Vance died, and his wife, Helen Vance, was seriously injured. The circumstances were difficult to ignore. Someone had deliberately transformed an ordinary delivery into a lethal weapon. The person who sent it did not have to enter Vance's home or confront him directly. The package could travel through the mail and arrive at a time and place chosen by the recipient himself. The victim could unknowingly carry the weapon into his own home and open it without realizing that. The danger was already in his hands. At that point, investigators could have treated the bombing as a targeted assassination. A federal judge had been killed, and his position within the judicial system immediately raised questions about motive. But 2 days later, those questions became much more complicated. On December 18, 1989, another package bomb exploded at the office of Robert Robinson in Savannah, Georgia. Robinson was a civil rights attorney, and he was killed in the blast. His death changed the shape of the investigation. There was now another victim, in another state, with a professional background that appeared very different from that of Robert Vance. The first death had suggested an attack on a member of the federal judiciary. The second suggested something else. Investigators now had to ask whether the 2 men had been selected for a common reason or whether their deaths were part of separate motives connected by the same method. Then came the discovery of the other 2 packages. They had also been sent during December 1989. and they demonstrated that the person responsible had not limited the campaign to 2 targets. One was directed toward an NAACP facility in Jacksonville, Florida. Another was sent to the federal court system in Atlanta. Neither produced another death because the devices were discovered and neutralized before they could cause further casualties. Their survival was significant. Without those 2 discoveries, the number of victims could have been much greater. But from an investigative perspective, the packages also created a difficult puzzle. For packages meant for targets, and the targets did not appear to fit neatly into a single category. There was a federal judge, there was a civil rights lawyer, there was an NAACP facility, and there was another target connected to the federal courts. The pattern could be interpreted in several ways, and each interpretation suggested a different kind of offender. If the federal judiciary was the central target, then the packages sent toward the courts could be understood as part of an attack against the legal system. Robert Vance's position would fit that theory. But the murder of Robinson complicated it. Robinson was a civil rights attorney, and the NAACP represented an institution associated with civil rights. Those targets could suggest a racial or political motive. An investigator looking only at the victims might reasonably wonder whether the bomber was motivated by extremist beliefs or hatred directed towards civil rights organizations and their work. The apparent pattern therefore threatened to pull the investigation in more than one direction. Yet the targets could also be viewed from another perspective. Perhaps the apparent differences were intentional. Perhaps the bomber wanted investigators to see several possible motives instead of one. The FBI eventually considered the possibility that the attacks on Robinson and the NAACP were intended to create the impression of a racist or politically extremist campaign, while the real motivation was connected to a personal grievance against the justice system. This possibility was important because it changed the meaning of the targets. Instead of asking only, "What do these victims have in common?" investigators had to ask another question. What does the person sending the packages want us to think? That was a much more complicated problem. The victims were not simply clues to the identity of the attacker. They might also have been part of a deliberate attempt to confuse the investigation. The death of Robert Robinson became particularly important in this respect. His killing came only 2 days after Vance's death, creating the appearance of a rapidly expanding campaign. Investigators could no longer assume that the first bombing had been an isolated attack. The second explosion demonstrated that someone was willing to send lethal devices across state lines, and that additional targets might already have been selected. The fact that other bombs had been found meant that the danger was continuing even after Vance's death. For the people investigating the case, time mattered. Every undiscovered package potentially represented another victim. Every target could be the next location where an explosion occurred. The investigation, therefore, had to move beyond the individual crime scenes and search for the connections linking the packages together. The 4 devices became a central part of that process. Investigators examined the circumstances surrounding each package and began looking for evidence that could reveal whether they had been created by the same person. The locations were different, the victims were different, and the apparent motives were different. But the use of package bombs created a common thread. It suggested planning and purpose rather than random violence. The question was whether that common method could lead investigators to the person responsible. The case also raised another difficult issue. Why would someone who supposedly wanted to retaliate against the justice system include targets that seemed unrelated to the courts? The answer would eventually lead investigators toward the theory of deliberate misdirection. If the attacker wanted revenge against the judicial system, the selection of a civil rights attorney and an NAACP facility could make the campaign appear to be something else. The apparent motive could become a shield protecting the real motive. At the same time, the federal courts remained present in the list of targets. That fact would later become increasingly important when investigators examined Walter Moody's history. Moody had spent years believing that the legal system had treated him unfairly. His previous conviction had involved a pipe bomb, and his resentment had continued long after the case ended. In the 1980s, he also had a legal matter associated with the 11th Circuit, where Robert Vance served as a judge. The connection was not proof of guilt, but it gave investigators a possible explanation for why Vance might have been selected. Still, at this stage, the case could not rest on motive alone. Investigators needed evidence that connected a particular person to the physical devices. The bombing of Vance provided a crime scene. The killing of Robinson provided another. The two unexploded devices offered additional evidence and potentially an opportunity to study the attack without another person being killed. Together, the four packages gave investigators a broader picture of the campaign. 2 had reached their targets. 2 had been stopped. 2 people were dead. 1 victim had survived with serious injuries, and several institutions had been placed in danger. The case was no longer about one mysterious package in one Alabama kitchen. It was a multi-state investigation involving the federal judiciary as civil rights attorney, the NAACP, and additional federal court targets. Each package seemed to raise another question. Each answer appeared to create another possibility. Somewhere behind those 4 packages was a single purpose, or perhaps several purposes deliberately made to look like one another. The investigators now had to determine which clues represented the truth and which might have been planted to send them in the wrong direction. The trail would eventually lead back to Walter Moody, but before that connection could be established, investigators needed to examine the bombs themselves. The devices were no longer merely weapons. They were evidence. Their construction could reveal whether the 4 attacks were connected. Their similarities could point toward a common source. And if those similarities reached back to an earlier bombing case involving Moody in 1972, the investigators would finally have a bridge between the past and the deadly events of December 1989. Until then, the case remained a disturbing collection of explosions, victims, and unanswered questions. Robert Vance was dead. Robert Robinson was dead. Helen Vance had been seriously injured. Other potential victims had narrowly escaped. 4 packages had been sent, and the person responsible had managed to make the ordinary act of receiving mail into something terrifying. The investigation had begun with a single question: who killed Judge Robert Vance? Now it had become something larger. Who had sent all 4 packages and why? The investigation into the December 1989 bombings had begun with a devastatingly simple fact. Someone had sent a package containing a bomb to the home of Judge Robert S. Vance, and the explosion had killed him. But as investigators examined the other attacks, the case became increasingly difficult to understand. There were multiple targets, multiple states, and more than one possible explanation. The federal judiciary appeared to be involved. Civil rights targets appeared to be involved. The possibility of political or racial extremism could not simply be dismissed. Yet the investigators also knew that the physical devices themselves might contain an answer. A bomb is not only an instrument of destruction. It can also carry the habits, methods, and technical choices of the person who constructed it. In this case, one investigator with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms noticed similarities between the devices used in the 1989 attacks and a bomb connected to Walter Leroy Moody Jr. 17 years earlier. That observation became one of the first major breakthroughs in the investigation. Before that connection could be fully understood, investigators had to look back to 1972. Walter Moody had already been involved in a case involving explosives. A bombing incident connected to his home had injured his wife, and Moody was convicted in connection with the possession of a pipe bomb. The earlier case was not simply an old entry in a criminal record. It was important because it placed Moody within a history involving explosives long before the deaths of Robert Vance and Robert E. Robinson. More importantly, Moody believed that the justice system had treated him unfairly. The conviction became part of a grievance that, according to the investigative theory later developed by the FBI, remained with him for years. The significance of 1972 therefore came from 2 separate directions. One was physical. Moody had a documented history involving a pipe bomb. The other was personal. he had developed a lasting resentment toward the courts. 17 years later, investigators were looking at a series of package bombs that had been used against people and institutions connected, directly or indirectly, to the justice system. The possibility that these two histories could be connected was too significant to ignore. But investigators still had to be careful. Similarity does not automatically establish responsibility. A person having once possessed or been convicted in connection with a bomb does not, by itself, prove that the same person constructed a later device. The investigation, therefore, had to establish whether the similarities between the earlier bomb and the 1,989 devices were meaningful enough to point toward the same source. Experts began comparing the devices. The work was important because the physical evidence offered something that motive alone could not. Moody's resentment toward the legal system could explain why he might have wanted revenge, but it could not establish that he had built the bombs. His history with explosives could show capability, but it could not establish that he had mailed the packages in 1989. The comparison of the devices had the potential to connect those separate pieces. As the examination continued, investigators increasingly focused on Moody. His name now stood at the intersection of several significant facts. He had a history involving explosives. He had been convicted in the earlier case. He believed that the justice system had treated him unfairly. He had remained resentful toward that system. And during the 1980s, he had a legal matter associated with the 11th Circuit, the same federal appellate court on which Robert Vance served. Yet the connection between Moody and Vance remained indirect in one important respect. Vance had not been the person directly responsible for the 1972 decision that Moody resented. He had not personally created the legal circumstances that Moody considered unjust. But the investigators' theory was that this distinction might not have mattered to Moody. A person consumed by resentment toward an institution could eventually stop separating individual responsibility from institutional identity. Vance was a judge on the 11th Circuit. He represented the federal judiciary. In that sense, investigators believed he could have become a symbol of the system Moody wanted to punish. This interpretation also helped explain why the investigation could not be reduced to a conventional personal dispute. There was no need for Vance and Moody to have a close personal relationship. The alleged motive operated at the level of representation. Vance's position made him part of the institution Moody resented. That possibility made the murder particularly disturbing. It suggested that the victim might not have been selected because of something he had personally done, but because of what he represented. At the same time, the presence of Robert Robinson and the NAACP among the targets continued to complicate the picture. If Moody's anger was directed toward the judiciary, why attack a civil rights attorney? Why target an NAACP facility? Those questions remained important because they could not be explained simply by pointing to Moody's legal history. Investigators considered whether these targets might have been chosen to create a false impression about the motive. If the attacks appeared to be motivated by racism or political extremism, attention could be directed away from the personal grievance against the courts. The idea of deliberate misdirection became another part of the emerging investigative theory. The bomber, in this interpretation, was not merely selecting victims. He was potentially creating a narrative for investigators to follow. The targets could function as clues, but misleading ones. The deeper investigators looked, the more important it became to separate what the attacks seemed to mean from what they might actually have meant. That distinction was essential in a case where the victims came from different professional and institutional backgrounds. The physical similarities between the bombs offered investigators a more objective path. The devices could be examined without relying on assumptions about ideology or psychology. If the construction of the 1989 bombs resembled the earlier device associated with Moody, then the history of 1972 could no longer be treated as a relevant background. It could become part of the chain of evidence. The FBI's investigation, therefore, began to move along a clearer line. First came the bombing of Robert Vance, then the discovery of additional package bombs, and the killing of Robert Robinson. Then the examination of the devices. And finally, the comparison with the earlier bomb associated with Moody. Each step narrowed the field, yet investigators still needed more. They had to establish not only that Moody had a history involving explosives, but that he was connected to the specific attacks of 1989. That meant examining more than the devices. Investigators would look at his communications, his relationships, his transactions, and his activities. They would examine the people around him and search for evidence that could place him within the larger campaign. The investigation would eventually become known as VanPack, a name derived from the Vance package bomb. But before VanPack became a large federal investigation, there was a crucial moment when the past and present began to overlap. A bomb from 1972 had similarities to bombs from 1989. The man connected to the earlier device had a continuing grievance against the justice system. And one of the victims in 1989 was a judge serving on the very appellate court connected to Moody's. Later legal history. None of these facts alone was enough to solve the case. Together, however, they formed a theory that investigators could test. The significance of that theory was not simply that it gave them a suspect. It gave them a reason to look deeper. Instead of treating the 4 package bombs as a collection of unrelated attacks, investigators could begin asking whether they had been created by the same person. Instead of viewing Moody's history as an old criminal case, they could examine whether it provided clues to the new crimes. And instead of viewing Robert Vance's position as a coincidence, they could consider whether his role within the federal judiciary had made him a target. The shadow of 1972 was beginning to fall across December 1989. The earlier bombing, the conviction, the resentment, and the later connection to the 11th Circuit were no longer separate pieces of history. They were becoming part of one investigative narrative. But a narrative was not enough. The investigators would eventually have to take that theory into a much larger search for evidence. They would need to examine the packages, the materials, the communications, the people connected to Moody, and the statements that could reveal what he knew. The next stage would be the systematic investigation known as VanPack. It would transform a collection of terrifying bombings into a case that could ultimately be brought before a jury. For now, however, the crucial breakthrough was more limited but no less important. Investigators had found a possible bridge between the deadly devices of 1989 and the explosive case that had marked Walter Moody's life 17 years earlier. The question was no longer simply whether Moody had once been connected to a bomb. The question was whether that old history had returned in a new form, and whether the man who had spent years believing the courts had wronged him had finally turned that grievance into violence against the system itself. Once investigators recognized the possible connection between the package bombs of 1989 and the earlier explosive case involving Walter Moody, the investigation entered a new phase. The death of Judge Robert S. Vance was no longer being examined as an isolated assassination. The bombing of Robert E. Robinson, the 2 additional devices that had been discovered and neutralized, and Moody's history with explosives were becoming pieces of the same investigative puzzle. The FBI gave the investigation a name, VanPack, derived from Vance package bomb. The name reflected the case's starting point, but the investigation itself quickly became much broader. The challenge facing investigators was straightforward to describe and difficult to solve. They had to determine who had constructed the bombs, who had mailed them, why the targets had been selected, and whether the same person was responsible for all 4 devices. They also had to establish whether Walter Moody's history was genuinely connected to the 1989 attacks, or whether the similarities were simply coincidence. The investigators therefore examined the physical evidence associated with the packages and the explosive devices. Materials used in the bombs became important. So did the traces associated with the packages themselves. The earlier device connected to Moody in 1972 provided investigators with something against which the newer devices could be compared. The similarity noticed by an ATF investigator gave the investigation a direction, but it did not eliminate the need for additional evidence. Moody's past could explain why investigators were interested in him. It could not, by itself, prove that he had sent the packages that killed Vance and Robinson. The investigation had to build a chain connecting the suspect to the attacks. The 4 devices were therefore central to the process. According to a Justice Department document, Moody had constructed 4 explosive devices in 1989 and sent them to different locations. The number was significant because it corresponded to the broader pattern investigators had already discovered. 4 package bombs sent to targets in Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. 2 had exploded. 2 had been discovered before they could cause additional deaths. The pattern gave investigators a framework for examining the case. The first fatal device had killed Vance at his home in Mountain Brook. The second had killed Robinson at his office in Savannah. The remaining devices had been directed toward other targets, including an NAACP facility in Jacksonville and the federal court system in Atlanta. Investigators had to determine whether these apparently different destinations were part of one plan. The answer mattered because the targets appeared on the surface to suggest more than one possible motive. Robert Vance was a federal appellate judge. The federal courts were also among the targets. That pattern was consistent with the possibility that the bomber was attacking the judicial system. But Robinson was a civil rights attorney, and the NAACP was also targeted. Those attacks could lead investigators toward an entirely different explanation. They might suggest racism, political extremism, or hostility towards civil rights organizations. If that interpretation were correct, then the bombing of Vance might have been part of a much larger ideological campaign. But the FBI eventually considered another possibility. The apparent diversity of the targets might have been deliberate. The attacks against Robinson and the NAACP could have been intended to make investigators believe that the bomber was motivated by racial hatred or political extremism. If so, the targets were doing more than serving as victims. They were potentially being used to construct a false explanation for the crimes. This possibility made the investigation more complicated. Investigators could not simply look at the victims and assume that their identities revealed the motive. They had to examine the evidence behind the attacks and determine what connected the apparently different targets. The connection to the federal judiciary remained especially important. Moody had spent years angry at the justice system because of what he believed was unfair treatment. His grievance had begun with the earlier legal case involving explosives in 1972. The consequences of that case had remained significant in his life. During the 1980s, he also had a legal matter associated with the 11th Circuit, the same appellate court on which Robert Vance served. The connection did not mean that Vance was responsible for Moody's earlier problems. He was not. But investigators believed that Moody's resentment had become directed toward the judicial system as a whole. Vance, because of his position, could therefore represent the institution Moody believed had wronged him. That theory offered a possible explanation for one of the most important questions in the investigation: why Robert Vance? But the FBI still needed to establish whether the same theory could account for the other attacks. The physical evidence offered a way to approach that question without relying entirely on assumptions about motive. Investigators examined the explosive devices, the materials associated with them, the packages, and the circumstances surrounding their delivery. They also examined Moody's history and the people connected to him. Communications and telephone activity became part of the investigation. Transactions were examined. Investigators considered individuals who had interacted with Moody. They also examined the unexploded devices because those bombs represented evidence that had survived without being consumed by a fatal blast. Every surviving piece of evidence could potentially help establish a connection between the attacks and the person investigators were beginning to suspect. This was the nature of Vanpack, not a single dramatic discovery, but the gradual assembly of separate pieces. The bombing scene in Mountain Brook provided one piece. The death of Robinson provided another. The unexploded devices provided others. Moody's history with explosives provided background. His resentment toward the courts provided a possible motive. His connection to the 11th Circuit provided a possible link to Vance. And the similarities between the 1989 devices and the earlier bomb connected to Moody gave investigators a physical reason to continue looking at him. Yet the investigation also had to account for what was not known. There was no simple eyewitness account of Moody mailing the packages. The bombs had traveled through the postal system. That meant investigators had to reconstruct the case through evidence rather than through a direct observation of the crime. The absence of a straightforward eyewitness made the physical and circumstantial evidence even more important. The investigators needed to demonstrate that the similarities between the devices were meaningful, that Moody had the relevant history and connections, and that the other evidence placed him within the campaign. At the same time, the investigators had to consider whether the apparent racial or political pattern was genuine or deliberately constructed. If the bomber had intended to misdirect law enforcement, then accepting the obvious explanation too quickly could have allowed the real motive to remain hidden. The case demanded that investigators look beyond appearances. A federal judge had been killed. A civil rights attorney had been killed. A civil rights organization had been targeted. The federal courts had been targeted. These facts could be arranged into several different stories. Vanpak required investigators to determine which story was supported by the evidence. As the investigation progressed, attention increasingly focused on Moody. His name had already emerged because of the similarities between the bombs. His legal history gave investigators a possible motive. His connection to the 11th Circuit gave them a possible explanation for the selection of Vance. But the case still needed another layer of evidence that could reveal what Moody himself knew about the attacks. That would come through surveillance. Investigators began monitoring Moody and people associated with him. Court-authorized surveillance produced conversations that would become significant to the case. The FBI eventually obtained recordings in which Moody discussed the bombings. These conversations were important because they moved the investigation beyond the physical characteristics of the devices and into the words of the person under suspicion. Later, when Moody was held in connection with another matter, authorities also obtained evidence from conversations in custody. The statements he made would become part of the prosecution's case. By this point, the investigation had developed into something much more substantial than the original search for a bomber. The FBI had a suspect whose past involved explosives, whose relationship with the courts was marked by resentment, whose legal history intersected with the 11th Circuit, and whose name had become connected to the physical evidence. The investigators were now building toward an arrest, but they still had to establish the full case. Vanpak had started with an explosion in a kitchen in Mountain Brook. It had expanded through 2 deaths, 2 additional bomb threats, several states, and a confusing collection of targets. Now it was narrowing again, toward one man. The packages had created uncertainty, but they had also left evidence behind. The victims had seemed to point in different directions, but the investigation was beginning to identify a possible common motive. And the suspect who emerged from that process was no longer simply a man with an old conviction involving explosives. Walter Moody was becoming the central figure in a federal investigation that would eventually lead to his arrest in July 1990. But before that happened, investigators would rely increasingly on the evidence gathered through surveillance, communications, forensic examination, and the reconstruction of Moody's connection to the attacks. The question was no longer whether the 4 packages were connected. The question was whether all of the evidence could establish that Walter Moody was the person who had sent them. By 1990, the investigation into the package bomb attacks had developed into a case centered increasingly on Walter Leroy Moody Jr., but suspicion was not the same as proof. The investigators had already identified important connections. Moody had a history involving explosives. He had been convicted in connection with the possession of a pipe bomb after a 1972 incident in which his wife was injured. He had maintained that the justice system had treated him unfairly. His resentment toward the courts had continued for years. During the 1980s, he had a legal matter associated with the 11th Circuit, the same federal appellate court on which Robert S. Vance served. And, perhaps most importantly, investigators had identified similarities between the devices used in the 1989 attacks and the earlier bomb associated with Moody. Yet none of those facts alone could establish that Moody had murdered Vance or killed Robert E. Robinson. A history with explosives was not proof of a later bombing. Anger toward the courts was not proof of murder. And a connection to the 11th Circuit was not proof that Moody had selected Vance as a target. The investigation, therefore, entered a critical stage. Investigators had to turn suspicion into evidence. The FBI continued examining the 4 explosive devices associated with the campaign. 2 had exploded, killing Vance and Robinson. 2 others had been discovered and neutralized before they could kill anyone. Their existence was especially important because they provided investigators with additional material to examine. The devices could be compared, and the similarities between them could be evaluated alongside the earlier device associated with Moody. Investigators also examined the materials and other physical evidence connected with the packages. The goal was to establish whether the devices were products of the same source and whether that source could be connected to Moody. The case was gradually being assembled from multiple directions. There was the physical evidence. There was Moody's history. There was the possible motive. And there were the relationships between the suspect, the courts, and the targets. The investigation also expanded into Moody's communications and associations. Investigators examined telephone activity, transactions, correspondence, and the people who had been in contact with him. Each category represented another opportunity to establish a connection between Moody and the bombing campaign. This was important because the crimes had been committed indirectly. The killer had not necessarily needed to appear at the scene of an explosion. The bombs had been sent through the mail. There was therefore no simple moment when an investigator could say, "This is the person who placed the device." Instead, the case had to be reconstructed from the evidence left behind before, during, and after the attacks. The more investigators learned about Moody, the more significant the earlier history became. His 1972 conviction involving a pipe bomb was not merely a distant criminal episode. It provided investigators with evidence that Moody had previously been associated with an explosive device. More importantly, it was tied to the grievance that investigators believed could explain the 1989 attacks. Moody believed that the legal system had treated him unfairly. The dispute had not ended, in his mind, with the conclusion of the earlier case. His resentment continued into later years, and his subsequent legal connection to the 11th Circuit created a possible bridge to Robert Vance. The theory was disturbing precisely because Vance had not been directly responsible for the decision. Moody resented. Yet investigators believed that Moody could have viewed the judge as a representative of the system itself. In that interpretation, the victim was not selected because of a personal relationship with the killer. He was selected because of what he represented. The presence of other targets continued to complicate the theory. Robert E. Robinson, a civil rights attorney, had been killed in Savannah. A NAACP facility in Jacksonville had also been targeted. Those attacks could have suggested that the bombers' motives were racial or political. But investigators considered the possibility that these targets had been selected to misdirect them. If the attacks appeared to come from someone motivated by racism or political extremism, investigators might look for an entirely different type of offender. The apparent motive could become a distraction from the actual grievance. This possibility made the evidence against Moody even more important. The investigators could not simply point to the targets and say that they revealed the killer's beliefs. They had to establish a connection through evidence that was less dependent on interpretation. Physical evidence became particularly significant in this respect. The similarities between the 1989 devices and the earlier bomb associated with Moody provided a tangible link. The investigation could now ask a more precise question. Were the similarities sufficient to indicate that the same person was responsible? If the answer was yes, then Moody's history and his resentment toward the courts would take on a different meaning. They would no longer stand alone as circumstantial background. They would become part of a larger body of evidence. The FBI's investigation eventually included surveillance of Moody and people around him. The surveillance was authorized through the appropriate legal process, and investigators obtained recordings of conversations. These recordings became important because they offered investigators access to Moody's own words. Rather than relying solely on what others believed about him, investigators could examine what Moody himself said. The FBI reported that conversations were recorded in which Moody discussed the bombings. These statements became part of the evidence gathered during the investigation. Later, when Moody was being held in connection with another matter, authorities also obtained evidence from conversations in custody. Again, the significance was not simply that Moody had been suspected of the crimes. Investigators were gathering material that they believed connected him directly to the bombing campaign. His own statements could potentially reveal knowledge that would be difficult to explain if he had been completely uninvolved. By this point, the case against Moody consisted of several overlapping elements. There was his prior involvement with an explosive device. There was the long-standing grievance against the courts. There was his connection to the 11th Circuit. There were the similarities between the earlier bomb and the devices used in 1989. There were the investigative findings concerning the 4 package bombs. There were the communications and surveillance evidence. And there was the broader pattern of targets, including both judicial and civil rights institutions. None of these elements should be understood in isolation. Their importance came from the way investigators believed they fit together. The challenge was to demonstrate that the 4 bombings were part of one campaign, and that Moody was the person behind it. As the investigation continued, the question of motive also became clearer. The FBI's theory was that Moody's resentment toward the justice system had eventually turned into a desire for revenge. Robert Vance, as a federal appellate judge, represented the judicial institution at the center of that resentment. The other targets may have served to obscure that motive. The campaign, therefore, appeared to have 2 levels. On the surface were different victims and institutions that could suggest different explanations. Beneath that surface was the possibility of a personal grievance directed against the legal system. The investigators now had to determine whether that theory could survive scrutiny in court. By July 1990, the investigation had accumulated enough evidence for Moody to be arrested. His arrest marked a major turning point. The search for an unknown bomber had become a prosecution against a named defendant. But an arrest was only the beginning of another difficult stage. The government would have to present its evidence in a courtroom and persuade a jury that Moody was responsible for the crimes. The prosecution would have to establish connections between the defendant and the explosive devices, between the devices and the victims, and between the apparent motive and the alleged acts. The defense would have an opportunity to challenge those connections. Every piece of evidence would have to withstand examination. The government's theory could not simply be that Moody had once possessed a pipe bomb or that he had been angry with the courts. It had to be that the evidence taken together demonstrated his responsibility for the 1989 campaign. That distinction was crucial. True crime stories can sometimes make an investigation appear inevitable when viewed from the end. Once the suspect has been identified and convicted, the earlier clues can seem obvious. But at the time, investigators did not have the benefit of hindsight. They were working through uncertainty. They had to consider different motives and different suspects. They had to determine whether the similarities between devices were meaningful. They had to interpret the significance of the targets. And they had to establish whether the man whose history seemed to fit the emerging theory could be connected to the actual crimes. The arrest of Walter Moody in July 1990 showed that investigators believed they had crossed that threshold. The case was ready to move from investigation to prosecution. The next stage would bring the evidence into a federal courtroom, where Moody would face an extraordinary number of charges. The government would present the results of the investigation, including the evidence gathered from the devices, Moody's history, his connections, and the surveillance of his conversations. The defense would challenge the government's account and offer its own explanation for the killings. The 4 packages had created a mystery. The investigation had produced a suspect. Now the courts would have to decide whether the evidence established that Walter Moody was the man behind the bombs that had killed Robert Vance and Robert Robinson and threatened others across 3 states. By the time Walter Leroy Moody Jr. entered the federal court process, the investigation had transformed a series of frightening explosions into a case with an enormous evidentiary record. The government was no longer asking investigators to determine who might have been responsible. It was asking a jury to decide whether the man at the center of the investigation was responsible for the package bomb campaign that had killed Judge Robert S. Vance and civil rights attorney Robert E. Robinson, injured Helen Vance, and placed additional people and institutions in danger. Moody had been arrested in July 1990 after months of investigation. The case against him had developed through several different kinds of evidence. Investigators had examined the explosive devices and identified similarities between the 1989 bombs and the earlier bomb associated with Moody in 1972. They had examined his history with explosives and his long-standing resentment toward the justice system. They had considered his legal connection to the 11th Circuit, where Robert Vance served as a judge. They had investigated his communications, transactions, correspondence, and associations. And through court-authorized surveillance, they had obtained recordings of conversations in which Moody discussed the bombings. The government therefore had more than one path by which it intended to connect Moody to the attacks. But a criminal trial is not simply an explanation of what investigators believe happened. It is a test of evidence. The prosecution had to present a coherent case capable of persuading a jury beyond the required legal standard. The defense, meanwhile, had the opportunity to challenge the government's interpretation of the evidence and to offer another explanation for the deaths and bombings. The central question remained direct. Was Walter Moody the person responsible for the campaign? On June 28, 1991, the federal jury reached its decision. Moody was found guilty on 71 counts related to the bombing campaign. The number itself revealed the extraordinary scope of the prosecution. This was not a case involving a single charge arising from one isolated explosion. The verdict covered a broad collection of federal offenses associated with the package bombs, the deaths, and the use and transportation of explosives. Among the matters included were the killing of Robert Vance, the killing of Robert Robinson, the use and transportation of explosives, the mailing of explosive devices, and other federal offenses connected to the campaign. For investigators, the verdict represented the culmination of the Van Pack investigation. For the victims' families and those who had been targeted, it meant that the person the government had identified as responsible had been held accountable in federal court. Yet the trial also reflected one of the most complicated aspects of the case: the question of motive. Why would Walter Moody have wanted to kill a federal judge? The government's theory traced that motive back to the earlier legal conflict that had shaped Moody's relationship with the courts. Moody had believed that the justice system had treated him unfairly after the 1972 case involving an explosive device. His resentment continued for years. During the 1980s, he had a legal matter associated with the 11th Circuit, where Robert Vance served as a judge. Vance, however, had not been directly responsible for the decision from 1972 that Moody resented. The significance of Vance, according to the investigative theory, was therefore connected to his position rather than to a personal act against Moody. He represented the federal judicial system that Moody believed had wronged him. That distinction is important because it separates the government's theory of motive from the idea of a conventional personal feud. Vance was not presented simply as someone who had personally harmed Moody. He was viewed as a representative of an institution toward which Moody had developed deep resentment. The other victims and targets made the motive question even more complicated. Robert Robinson was a civil rights attorney. A NAACP facility in Jacksonville had also been targeted. Another package had been sent toward the federal court system in Atlanta. On the surface, these targets could have suggested a racist or extremist political motive. The defense challenged the government's account and, according to the information in the case record provided here, suggested that the Ku Klux Klan might have been responsible for the killings. Such an argument offered the jury an alternative explanation for the pattern of targets. If the attacks had been motivated by racism or political extremism, then Moody's alleged personal grievance against the courts would not necessarily explain the entire campaign. But the jury did not accept that explanation. The verdict established that the defense's alternative theory had not created sufficient doubt to prevent conviction. The government's evidence, considered as a whole, persuaded the jury that Moody was responsible for the crimes charged. The significance of the surveillance evidence was especially important within that broader picture. Investigators had not relied only on what they believed Moody might have intended. They had obtained recordings of conversations in which he discussed the bombings. They had also gathered evidence from conversations while he was being held in connection with another matter. These statements became part of the government's case. The prosecution could therefore present evidence not merely about Moody's history, but about statements attributed to Moody himself. The trial was the moment when all of those strands had to be brought together. The physical evidence from the bombs connected the attacks. Moody's history involving explosives established a relevant background. His resentment toward the courts provided a possible motive. His legal connection to the 11th Circuit helped explain why Vance could have become a target. The surveillance evidence added another dimension by placing Moody's own words within the investigative record. And the broader pattern of 4 package bombs showed that the prosecution was dealing with a campaign rather than an isolated event. When the jury returned its verdict on June 28, 1991, Moody was guilty on 71 counts. The federal sentence that followed was severe. Moody received 7 consecutive life sentences, along with a total of 400 years in federal prison, according to the appellate record. The sentence effectively ensured that, under the federal case alone, Moody would spend the rest of his life in prison. 7 consecutive life sentences carried a clear message about the scale and seriousness of the crimes for which he had been convicted. The federal case had reached its conclusion, but the legal story of Walter Moody was not finished. The conviction did not end the matter because the state of Alabama still intended to prosecute him for the murder of Robert Vance. That meant Moody would face another trial, separate from the federal proceedings that had already resulted in multiple life sentences. The distinction between the 2 cases was important. The federal prosecution addressed the broad bombing campaign and the many federal offenses connected to it. The Alabama case would focus specifically on the killing of Robert Vance. From the government's perspective, the federal conviction had already established Moody's responsibility for the broader campaign. But Alabama's prosecution sought its own judgment for the death of the federal judge. The transition from the federal courtroom to the Alabama courtroom also demonstrated how the same act could carry consequences under different levels of law. The murder of Vance was part of the federal bombing investigation, but it could also be prosecuted as a capital offense under Alabama law. The federal convictions, therefore, did not bring the entire legal process to an end. Instead, they became one stage in a much longer judicial history. For the investigators who had worked on Van Pack, the federal verdict represented the successful conclusion of an enormous search for evidence. The unknown bomber who had once been hidden behind packages and explosions now had a name, a conviction, and multiple life sentences. But for the legal system, one final question remained. What punishment would Moody receive for the death of Robert Vance? In 1996, he would return to court in Alabama to face that question. The federal jury had already found him guilty on 71 counts. The federal sentence had already placed him behind bars for the remainder of his life. Yet the state prosecution would pursue an even more severe punishment. The case would once again place Robert Vance at its center, not as a symbol of the federal judiciary, but as a husband, a judge, and a victim whose life had ended when he opened a package in his own home. The next courtroom would determine whether Walter Moody would receive the ultimate punishment for that killing. The federal trial had answered one question. The jury believed Moody was responsible for the bombing campaign. The Alabama trial would ask another. What should the law do with a man convicted of deliberately killing a federal judge with a package bomb? By the time that question reached court, the investigation that had begun with uncertainty in December 1989 had already produced its central conclusion. 4 packages had been sent. 2 people had been killed. Others had been injured or placed in danger. Investigators had followed the evidence backward to 1972 and forward through Moody's communications and associations. A federal jury had examined the case and returned 71 guilty verdicts. And Walter Moody had received 7 consecutive life sentences and 400 years in federal prison. Yet the story still had one more judicial chapter. Alabama was not finished with Walter Moody. The federal convictions had already established the scale of the case, but for the state of Alabama, one question remained unresolved. Who would be held responsible under state law for the death of Judge Robert S. Vance? Walter Leroy Moody Jr. had already been convicted in federal court on 71 counts and sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences, along with 400 years in federal prison. Yet the bombing that killed Vance had occurred in Mountain Brook, Alabama, and Alabama prosecutors pursued their own case against Moody. In 1996, Moody was brought to trial in Alabama for the murder of Robert Vance. The state prosecution placed the judge's death at the center of the proceedings. By then, the broader circumstances of the bombing campaign were known. Vance had been killed on December 16, 1989, when he opened a package containing a bomb at his home. His wife, Helen Vance, had been seriously injured. 2 days later, another package bomb killed Robert E. Robinson, a civil rights attorney in Savannah, Georgia. 2 other devices had been discovered and neutralized before they could cause further deaths. The FBI investigation, known as VanPack, had traced the attacks through physical evidence, Moody's history, his connections, and evidence obtained through surveillance. The federal jury had accepted the government's case. Now Alabama had to present its own case concerning Vance's murder. The charge was capital murder. The classification reflected the extraordinary circumstances of the crime. Vance was a federal judge, and the killing had been carried out with an explosive device. The prosecution therefore sought the death penalty. The Alabama proceedings brought the case back to the individual at its center. Robert Vance was not simply a position within the 11th Circuit. He was a man who had been at home with his wife when the package arrived. The circumstances of his death remained disturbing precisely because of how ordinary the setting had been. The danger did not announce itself as a confrontation. It arrived disguised as a package. There was no opportunity for Vance to prepare for an attack once he opened it. The explosion transformed his home into the scene of a targeted killing, while Helen Vance survived with serious injuries. For the prosecution, the challenge was to connect Moody to that act beyond the broader federal convictions. The state case necessarily returned to the evidence developed during the investigation. The similarities between the devices used in 1989 and the earlier bomb associated with Moody were important. So was Moody's history with explosives. The 1972 case had resulted in his conviction after an incident in which his wife was injured, and Moody had maintained that the justice system had treated him unfairly. The grievance remained relevant because investigators believed it provided the underlying motive for the later attacks. During the 1980s, Moody had also been connected to a legal matter involving the 11th Circuit, where Vance served as a judge. Yet there was a crucial fact that investigators had never ignored. Vance had not been directly responsible for the original decision that Moody resented. The alleged motive, therefore, depended on the idea that Moody's anger had expanded from a particular legal dispute into hostility toward the judicial system itself. In that interpretation, Vance had become a representative of the institution rather than the individual who had personally caused Moody's grievance. That distinction was central to understanding why a federal judge could become a target even without being directly responsible for Moody's earlier conviction. The prosecution also had to contend with the confusing pattern of the other targets. Robert Robinson was a civil rights attorney. The NAACP facility in Jacksonville had been targeted. These facts could suggest an entirely different motive. During the legal proceedings, the defense advanced an alternative theory involving the Ku Klux Klan. The argument presented the possibility that the killings could have been committed by someone motivated by racial extremism rather than by Moody's personal grievance against the courts. But the earlier federal jury had rejected that alternative explanation when it convicted Moody on the 71 federal counts. The Alabama prosecution now presented the state's case against the same defendant for Vance's death. The physical evidence remained an important foundation. The bomb itself had been the instrument of the killing, and investigators had connected characteristics of the 1989 devices to the earlier bomb associated with Moody. That connection mattered because it tied the present crime to Moody's established history with explosives. The investigation had not stopped at identifying similarities. It had also examined communications, transactions, correspondence, and individuals associated with Moody. Court-authorized surveillance had produced recordings in which Moody discussed the bombings, and authorities had obtained additional evidence from conversations while he was being held in connection with another matter. The cumulative nature of the evidence was important. The case did not depend upon one isolated clue. Instead, investigators had built a body of evidence that they believed connected Moody to the bombing campaign and explained why Vance had been selected. The Alabama trial therefore represented another examination of that chain. The defense had the opportunity to challenge the government's evidence and its interpretation of Moody's motives. The prosecution had to establish the elements of capital murder under Alabama law. At the center of the case was the fact that Vance had died because a bomb had been deliberately placed inside a package and sent to his home. The act was not presented as accidental. The government maintained that the device had been created and sent with the purpose of killing or seriously injuring its recipient. The circumstances surrounding Helen Vance's injuries reinforced the seriousness of the attack. She had been close to the explosion and survived, but with severe injuries. The violence had therefore extended beyond the intended fatal result to another member of the household. The case also raised a broader concern about the security of judges and the independence of the judiciary. Vance had been targeted because of his position, according to the prosecution's theory. If a judge could be killed at home by a package bomb because of decisions or institutions associated with the courts, then the threat extended beyond one individual. It became an attack on the principle that judges must be able to perform their duties without fear of retaliation. The bombing demonstrated how vulnerable even a highly protected institution could become when the weapon was concealed inside an ordinary package. The case also demonstrated the persistence of a grievance. Almost 17 years separated the 1972 explosive case from the 1989 bombing. For investigators, that span of time was significant. The alleged motive had not emerged suddenly. It had developed over years through Moody's continuing resentment toward the justice system. The connection to the 11th Circuit in the 1980s provided the more immediate link to Vance. Yet the investigation's theory remained that the deeper source of the hostility lay in the earlier case. The Alabama jury ultimately found Moody guilty of capital murder in connection with the death of Robert Vance. The conviction opened the way for the sentence the state had sought. In 1997, Walter Moody was sentenced to death. The punishment was the most severe available under Alabama law. It meant that, despite the 7 consecutive federal life sentences and 400 years already imposed after the federal trial, Moody would remain under a separate sentence of death for Vance's murder. The legal process did not end with that sentence. Moody continued to challenge his conviction and death sentence through appeals for many years. His case remained within the courts for more than 2 decades after the Alabama verdict. The persistence of the appeals reflected the nature of capital punishment itself. A death sentence does not ordinarily lead immediately to execution. It enters a prolonged legal process in which courts examine the conviction, the sentence, and the claims raised by the condemned prisoner. For Moody, those proceedings would continue through the years while he remained on death row. The contrast between the 1991 federal sentence and the 1997 Alabama sentence was striking. The federal court had already imposed punishment that effectively guaranteed Moody would never leave prison. 7 consecutive life sentences and 400 years. Alabama then imposed a sentence designed to end his life. The 2 cases reflected different legal responses to the same broader campaign. The federal prosecution addressed the extensive series of offenses surrounding the package bombs. The Alabama prosecution focused on the death of Robert Vance. Together, they represented the culmination of years of investigation and litigation. But the most important consequence of the Alabama conviction was not simply the sentence imposed on Moody. It was the final judicial recognition of the specific act that had begun the case, the deliberate killing of a federal judge in his own home. The bombing of Vance had started a massive investigation because it was both personal and institutional. A man had died, his wife had been seriously injured, and the federal judiciary had been confronted with an extraordinary form of violence. By 1997, the courts had reached their judgment. Walter Moody had been found responsible for the bombing campaign in federal court and for Vance's murder in Alabama. Yet the final chapter of the story was still years away. Moody would spend more than 2 decades under sentence of death. The legal challenges would continue, and as he aged inside the prison system, the case would take on another distinction. When Alabama eventually carried out the sentence in 2018, Walter Moody would be 83 years old. His execution would make him the oldest person executed in the United States in the modern era, following the reinstatement of the death penalty. But before that final moment, there would be years of appeals, legal arguments, and waiting. The man who had once directed his anger toward the courts would spend the remaining decades of his life inside the very justice system he had tried to attack. After the Alabama conviction in 1996 and the death sentence imposed in 1997, the story of Walter Leroy Moody entered a very different phase. The investigation was over. The major trials were over. The juries had reached their conclusions. Yet the legal process continued, because a death sentence does not automatically bring an immediate execution. Moody remained on death row while his case moved through years of appeals and legal challenges. By this point, the central facts of the case had already been established in court. Robert S. Vance had been killed by a package bomb at his home in Mountain Brook, Alabama, on December 16, 1989. His wife, Helen Vance, had been seriously injured. 2 days later, Robert E. Robinson, a civil rights attorney in Savannah, Georgia, was killed by another package bomb. 2 additional explosive packages had been discovered and neutralized before they could cause further deaths. The federal investigation, known as Van Pack, had connected the devices to Walter Moody through a combination of physical evidence. His history with explosives, his long-standing resentment toward the justice system, his legal connections, and evidence obtained through surveillance. In 1991, a federal jury convicted Moody on 71 counts. He received 7 consecutive life sentences and a total of 400 years in federal prison. Then Alabama pursued its own prosecution for Vance's murder. Moody was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. The sentence created a strange legal reality. Even without the Alabama death sentence, Moody had already received punishment that effectively guaranteed he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The federal sentences alone were overwhelming. 7 consecutive life sentences and hundreds of years in prison left no realistic prospect of release. Yet the Alabama case carried a different significance. It was specifically about the killing of Robert Vance, and the state sought the ultimate punishment for that death. The distinction between imprisonment and execution became central to the remaining years of Moody's life. He was no longer waiting to discover what a jury would decide. He was waiting to discover whether the courts would ultimately permit the state to carry out the sentence. Moody continued to challenge his conviction and death sentence. The appeals process became lengthy, extending across more than 2 decades. During those years, the underlying case remained a reminder of how an investigation could begin with a single unexplained explosion and eventually produce one of the most extensive bombing prosecutions of its era. But appeals also forced attention back onto the evidence and legal questions surrounding the case. The government had argued that the physical characteristics of the bombs connected the 1989 devices to the earlier explosive associated with Moody. Investigators had also relied on evidence gathered through surveillance. Court-authorized monitoring had produced conversations in which Moody discussed the bombings, and authorities obtained additional evidence from conversations while he was being held in connection with another matter. These pieces of evidence had helped prosecutors establish their case. The defense, meanwhile, had challenged the government's interpretation and offered an alternative explanation. The presence of Robert Robinson and the NAACP among the targets had always complicated the prosecution's theory of motive. A civil rights attorney and a civil rights organization seemed, on the surface, to point toward racism or political extremism. The defense raised the possibility that the Ku Klux Klan could have been responsible for the killings. But the juries did not accept that explanation. Instead, the courts ultimately accepted the prosecution's case that Moody was responsible for the bombing campaign and that his hostility toward the justice system provided the underlying motive. According to the investigative theory, the attacks against Robinson and the NAACP could have served as deliberate misdirection. If investigators believed the campaign was racially or politically motivated, they might look for an extremist organization rather than a man whose grievance centered on the courts. That possibility was one of the most unsettling elements of the case. It suggested that the targets may have been selected not only for what they represented to the bomber, but also for what they would appear to represent to investigators. The victims, in other words, could become part of a false narrative. Yet the ultimate legal findings rested on the totality of the evidence rather than on motive alone. The bomb devices provided a physical connection. Moody's history with explosives provided a relevant background. His resentment toward the justice system provided a possible motive. His connection to the 11th Circuit helped explain why Robert Vance could have been selected. The surveillance evidence added another layer by placing Moody's own words within the investigative record. The federal convictions and Alabama capital murder conviction represented the court's conclusion that these separate strands formed a sufficient case against him. As the years passed, Moody aged while remaining under sentence of death. The contrast between the man he had been in 1989 and the elderly prisoner he became was significant. When the bombings occurred, Moody was in his 50s. When his execution eventually took place, he was 83. More than a quarter of a century had passed since the deaths of Vance and Robinson. The world around the case had changed, but the legal consequences had not disappeared. The families of the victims had lived with the memory of the attacks for decades. Helen Vance had survived the explosion that killed her husband, carrying the physical consequences of the attack. The death of Robert Robinson had also remained part of the case's human cost, and the existence of the 2 additional bombs meant that the campaign had threatened people who survived only because the devices were discovered in time. For those affected, the case was not simply a historical investigation. It represented lives interrupted by violence. Robert Vance had gone from an ordinary moment at home to a fatal explosion. Robinson had gone to his office and become the victim of another concealed weapon. The other targets had faced the possibility of the same fate. The legal process could determine guilt and punishment, but it could not undo those events. The lengthy appeals also illustrated the tension inherent in capital cases. The state had sentenced Moody to death, but the execution could not simply occur because a jury had imposed the sentence. The courts had to review the case. Years passed as Moody remained incarcerated. During that period, the significance of his age became increasingly unusual. By the time he reached his 80s, he had spent decades under the shadow of a death sentence. The passage of time did not alter the convictions. It did, however, make Moody's eventual execution historically unusual. Alabama continued to pursue the death sentence that had been imposed for Vance's murder. The state maintained that Moody had been responsible for the bombing that killed the federal judge and injured Helen Vance. The case remained an example of how violence directed against a judge could affect more than one individual. A judge is part of an institution, and an attack intended to punish a judge for his perceived role in the justice system can be understood as an attack on judicial independence itself. Robert Vance had been selected, according to the prosecution's theory, because he represented the federal judiciary. The fact that the attack occurred at his private residence made the threat even more disturbing. The boundary between professional responsibility and private life had been erased. The package had crossed that boundary without warning. By 2018, the appeals had reached their end. Walter Moody was 83 years old. He had spent decades in prison, carrying both the federal convictions and the Alabama death sentence. The state of Alabama was now prepared to carry out the punishment imposed for Vance's murder. On April 19, 2018, Moody was executed by lethal injection. His death marked the final act in a legal process that had begun nearly 3 decades earlier with the explosion at the Vance home. It also gave the case a distinction that drew national attention. Moody became the oldest person executed in the United States in a modern era after the death penalty had been reinstated. At the age of 83, his execution ended the legal journey of the man convicted of orchestrating the 1989 package bombing campaign. But it did not erase the story of those who had been killed or injured. Robert Vance remained the judge who died at home when a package bomb exploded in his kitchen. Helen Vance remained a survivor of the same attack. Robert Robinson remained another victim of the campaign. The two unexploded devices remained reminders of how much worse the toll could have been. And the investigation remained a warning about the danger created when personal grievance becomes directed toward institutions and the people who represent them. The most striking feature of the case was perhaps not the complexity of the investigation, but the length of the path from grievance to violence and from violence to justice. The origins of the alleged motive reached back to 1972. The attacks came in December 1989. The federal conviction followed in 1991. The Alabama capital murder conviction came in 1996, followed by the death sentence in 1997. Then came more than 2 decades of appeals. Finally, on April 19, 2018, the state carried out the sentence. Nearly 30 years separated the bombing of Robert Vance from the execution of Walter Moody. By then, the investigation had long since stopped being a mystery. The courts had reached their judgments. What remained was the human cost and the larger lesson. A package can look ordinary, a grievance can appear old and distant, and a judicial decision can seem like something contained entirely within a courtroom. But in the Vance case, the consequences crossed all of those boundaries. A grievance rooted in the past allegedly became a campaign of violence. An ordinary delivery became a weapon. A judge became a target because of what he represented. And the investigation that followed demonstrated how physical evidence, historical records, surveillance, and patient federal investigation could eventually uncover a crime designed to remain hidden behind the anonymity of the male. On April 19, 2018, the long legal journey of Walter Leroy Moody Jr. came to an end. At the age of 83, Moody was executed by lethal injection in Alabama for the murder of Judge Robert S. Vance. His execution closed a case that had begun almost 3 decades earlier with an explosion inside a private home in Mountain Brook, Alabama. But the end of the legal process did not make the case less disturbing. If anything, the passage of time made the full sequence of events more striking. In December 1989, a package had arrived at the home of a federal judge. It appeared to be an ordinary delivery, arriving during the Christmas season. Robert Vance opened it. The bomb exploded. Vance died, and his wife, Helen Vance, was seriously injured. 2 days later, another package bomb killed Robert E. Robinson, a civil rights attorney in Savannah, Georgia. 2 additional bombs were discovered and neutralized before they could cause further deaths. What first appeared to be a single assassination had become a multi-state bombing campaign. The investigation that followed, known as Van Pack, would eventually lead federal investigators to Walter Moody and uncover a motive that stretched back many years. The story began long before the package arrived at the Vance home. In 1972, Moody had been convicted in connection with the possession of a pipe bomb after an explosion at his home injured his wife. Moody believed that the justice system had treated him unfairly. That belief became a lasting grievance. The distance between the 1972 case and the 1989 bombing was nearly 17 years. But investigators ultimately viewed the earlier case as an important part of the motive behind the later attacks. Moody's anger had not simply disappeared when the original legal proceedings ended. It remained connected to his relationship with the courts. During the 1980s, Moody had a legal matter associated with the 11th Circuit, the federal appellate court on which Robert Vance served. Yet Vance had not been directly responsible for the original decision that Moody resented. That fact makes the alleged motive especially revealing. According to the prosecution's theory, Moody's anger had moved beyond an individual legal dispute and toward the judicial system itself. Vance could therefore become a symbolic target. He represented the institution Moody believed had wronged him. The other targets made the case harder to interpret. A federal judge and federal court system could reasonably suggest hostility toward the judiciary. But Robert Robinson was a civil rights attorney, and the NAACP facility in Jacksonville was also targeted. Those victims and institutions could create the appearance of an entirely different motive. Investigators considered the possibility that the attacks against Robinson and the NAACP were designed to make the campaign appear racially or politically motivated. If so, the apparent targets were part of a deliberate effort to mislead investigators. The case therefore required law enforcement to distinguish between what the bomber appeared to be saying through the selection of victims and what the evidence actually demonstrated. The physical evidence became central to that process. An ATF investigator noticed similarities between the 1989 explosive devices and the earlier bomb associated with Moody. That observation gave investigators a concrete reason to examine Moody more closely. The similarities did not exist in isolation. They were considered alongside Moody's history with explosives, his long-standing resentment toward the justice system, his connection to the 11th Circuit, and the pattern of targets. The FBI expanded the investigation dramatically. Investigators examined the materials used in the devices, the packages, communications, telephone activity, transactions, correspondence, and Moody's contacts with other people. They also examined the explosive devices that had been discovered before they could detonate. Every piece of surviving evidence offered another opportunity to establish the connection between Moody and the campaign. Surveillance provided another important layer. Through court-authorized monitoring, investigators obtained recordings of conversations involving Moody in which he discussed the bombings. Authorities also obtained evidence from conversations while Moody was being held in connection with another matter. These statements became part of the government's case. The investigation, therefore, did not depend upon one piece of physical evidence or one theory of motive. It developed through the accumulation of different forms of evidence that prosecutors believed pointed in the same direction. Moody was arrested in July 1990. The federal trial followed, and on June 28, 1991, a federal jury found him guilty on 71 counts related to the bombing campaign. The charges included offenses connected to the deaths of Vance and Robinson, the use and transportation of explosives, mailing explosive devices, and other federal crimes. Moody received 7 consecutive life sentences and a total of 400 years in federal prison. The federal sentence effectively ensured that he would remain incarcerated for the rest of his life. But Alabama was not finished. In 1996, Moody was tried for the murder of Robert Vance. He was convicted of capital murder, and in 1997 he was sentenced to death. That sentence began another lengthy legal chapter. Moody continued to challenge his conviction and sentence through appeals. More than 20 years would pass before the state ultimately carried out the death penalty. The extraordinary length of that process is part of what makes the case so unusual. When the bombing campaign occurred, Moody was in his 50s. By the time Alabama executed him, he was 83 years old. He had spent decades inside the prison system, first under the weight of his federal convictions, and then under a state death sentence. The execution on April 19, 2018, made Moody the oldest person executed in the United States in the modern era after the reinstatement of the death penalty. Alabama officials continued to identify him as responsible for the murder of Vance and the serious injuries suffered by Helen Vance. Yet the final act of the case was not simply about Moody. The victims remained at the heart of the story. Robert Vance was a federal judge whose life ended in his own home. He was not killed during a courtroom confrontation or while knowingly placing himself in danger. He was killed because a package had been turned into a weapon. Helen Vance survived, but she was seriously injured in the same explosion. Robert Robinson, another victim, died 2 days later in Savannah. The 2 additional bombs represented lives that might have been lost but were spared because the devices were discovered and neutralized. The full human cost of the campaign, therefore, cannot be measured only by the number of people who died. There were also survivors, families, investigators, court employees, and others who had to confront the possibility that another package could contain a lethal device. The bombing campaign also carried a broader meaning for the federal judiciary. A judge occupies a position intended to be independent from personal retaliation. Judges make decisions that inevitably leave some people dissatisfied, but the justice system depends upon those decisions being made without fear that an angry litigant will respond with violence. The murder of Robert Vance demonstrated how dangerous the consequences can become when a personal grievance is transformed into an attack on the people associated with an institution. The case, therefore, became more than the story of one murderer and one victim. It became an example of how hostility toward the justice system can evolve into a threat against judicial officials. There is also a deeper lesson in the time span of the case. The alleged roots of Moody's motive went back to 1972. The deadly campaign came in 1989. The federal conviction came in 1991. The Alabama conviction followed in 1996, and the death sentence was imposed in 1997. Execution did not occur until 2018. From beginning to end, the story covered decades. That long timeline makes the case a reminder that the consequences of violence do not end when the explosion is over. The immediate destruction may last seconds, but the investigation, prosecution, appeals, and suffering of survivors can continue for generations. The case also demonstrates the importance of patience in criminal investigation. At first, investigators faced a terrifying but confusing pattern. The victims appeared to point toward different motives. The bomber used the mail to remain physically distant from the targets. There was no simple eyewitness account that immediately identified the perpetrator. Instead, investigators built the case through physical evidence, historical connections, surveillance, and careful examination of the suspect's background. The similarities between the bombs and the earlier device associated with Moody became one of the critical links. His legal history provided a possible motive. The surveillance evidence provided another connection. The eventual convictions demonstrated that the evidence, taken together, persuaded the juries beyond the required legal standard. The most unsettling element of the story may be how ordinary the method appeared. A package is normally associated with routine life. Correspondence, business, gifts, deliveries. In this case, that normality became part of the danger. The weapon did not announce itself. It relied upon the recipient treating it as something harmless. That fact transformed the postal system into a means of delivering violence across state lines, without requiring the attacker to confront the victim personally. Yet the same system that had helped conceal the bomber's identity eventually became part of an investigation that uncovered him. The packages became evidence. The devices became evidence. The history behind the devices became evidence. And the investigation slowly connected those pieces. Robert Vance's death began with a package, but the story did not end with the explosion. It continued through the work of investigators, prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, jurors, and appellate courts. It continued through the memories of those who survived and those who lost someone. And it continued until April 19, 2018, when Walter Moody was executed. Looking back at the case, the most important fact is not the notoriety that eventually surrounded Moody. It is the lives that were taken and damaged by the campaign. Robert Vance died. Robert Robinson died. Helen Vance was seriously injured. Other people and institutions were targeted and placed in danger. The case should therefore be remembered first through the people who suffered, not through the man who caused the violence. The final lesson is equally stark. Grievances can persist for years, but they do not justify violence. A court ruling, however deeply resented, is not a personal license for revenge. And a judge is not merely a symbol of a system. A judge is a human being with a family, a home, and a life beyond the courtroom. Robert Vance's murder demonstrated the terrible consequences of forgetting that distinction. The bombing campaign began with an attempt to turn resentment into destruction. It ended with decades of investigation and litigation, culminating in an execution when Moody was 83. The mystery was eventually solved, the perpetrator was convicted, and the legal process reached its final point. But justice could not restore the lives that had been taken. It could only establish responsibility and impose punishment. That is perhaps the quietest and most difficult truth at the end of the Vance bombing case. The courts could determine what happened, but they could not make December 16, 1989 disappear. The package could not be unopened. The explosion could not be reversed. Robert Vance could not return home. Helen Vance could not escape what happened to her. Robert Robinson could not walk back into his office. What remained was the record, the evidence, the verdicts, the sentences, and the memories of those affected. And in that record, the case stands as a warning about the destructive power of unresolved grievance, the vulnerability of ordinary life to concealed violence, and the enduring responsibility of the justice system to seek truth without surrendering to fear.